The airport pulsed with the usual rhythm of travel, flashing monitors, suitcase wheels spinning over tile, and the occasional overhead announcement slicing through the white noise. But none of it fazed Celeste Morgan. She had done this 100 times before. A poised and commanding figure in her mid-30s, Celeste moved through the terminal with the kind of grace that turned heads, not from flash or bravado, but from something deeper. Dressed in an elegant charcoal blazer with a soft silk blouse tucked into expertly tailored pants, her look was polished but understated, professional without begging for validation. She didn't need to. She was the keynote speaker for the World Futures Summit in Zurich, the first Black woman ever invited to address the global audience of thought leaders. And she carried the weight of that honor, not with prideful swagger, but with reverent steadiness. This wasn't just a flight. It was a bridge to a moment she had built her whole career toward. And yet, as she stepped into the priority boarding line for first class, ticket in hand, she felt the subtle chill that always seemed to follow her in these spaces. The glance too long, the smile too forced, the silent question hanging in the air. Do you belong here? She'd learned to recognize it even when unspoken, especially then. She tightened her grip on the leather strap of her bag and held her head a little higher. The boarding process had just begun when the murmurs started, low, indistinct, but unmistakably centered around her. Celeste looked up from her phone and saw the man before her, a pilot, tall, rigid, and approaching with purpose. His uniform was crisp, and the silver at his temples seemed to match the sharpness of his gaze. He didn't greet her, didn't ask for her name. He simply looked at her seat number, and back at her with a skepticism so loud it didn't need words. "Ma'am," he said tightly, "this line is for first-class passengers only." Celeste blinked once. Her voice, when it came, was measured. "Yes, I'm aware. That's what my ticket says." She held it up, the bold black letters on white paper, clear and undeniable. Seat 1A, first class. But he didn't even glance at it. His eyes remained fixed on her, as though searching for a crack in her legitimacy, some sign that she'd slipped past the boundary of what he believed she was entitled to. The silence stretched. Around them, other passengers began to turn their heads. Celeste could feel the air shifting, thickening, the weight of invisible judgment pressing in. The pilot's jaw tensed. "I'll have to verify this with the gate staff," he muttered, and turned on his heel without waiting for a reply. She stood there, still as stone, her hands calm at her sides, but her heart tightening in her chest. She had done everything right. Booked early, paid in full, checked in with no issue. And yet, here she was, being questioned in public, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was, or rather, who they assumed she wasn't. The pilot returned moments later with a tight-lipped gate agent who glanced at Celeste, then at the screen, then back again. "It's valid," the agent said quietly. "She's confirmed in 1A." The pilot's lips barely moved. "Fine," he said. "Proceed." He stepped aside, not with apology, but with resignation, like someone conceding to a rule they didn't agree with. Celeste walked past him without a word, not because she had nothing to say, but because the sheer familiarity of the moment had hollowed out her desire to explain herself yet again. She had learned long ago that some people didn't want explanations. They wanted confirmation of their assumptions. And when they didn't get it, they made you pay for the discomfort of their misjudgment. Inside the aircraft, the luxury of first class, plush seats, ambient lighting, soft jazz playing just loud enough to calm the nerves, did little to ease the knot that had formed in her stomach. She found her seat, sat down, and exhaled slowly, trying to center herself. But then came the voice again, stern, insistent, and utterly devoid of shame. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step a seat in." It was him, the same pilot. He stood over her, arms crossed, eyes cold. "There's been a mistake. This seat isn't yours." Time slowed. Celeste blinked up at him, the absurdity of the moment crashing into her like a wave. "Yes," she said evenly, producing the ticket once more, her hand steady. "It is." The pilot didn't even glance at it. "Please step aside," he repeated. "We'll sort this out." The word we hung in the air like a lie. He had already decided there was a problem, and the problem, in his eyes, was her. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, Others whispered. One man outright stared, his expression unreadable. Celeste remained seated. If there's an issue, call your supervisor, she said, her voice calm but resolute. But I'm not moving. Her defiance wasn't loud, wasn't angry. It was simply firm. And in that moment, it carried more power than 1,000 raised voices. But the damage was done. She could feel it in her skin, the heat rising not from shame, but from the sick familiarity of it all. She had succeeded. She had excelled. She had risen beyond every obstacle placed in her path. And still, she had to defend her right to sit in a seat she had paid for. She wasn't a disruption. She was a mirror, reflecting back a truth that many preferred to ignore. That in certain spaces, a Black woman's presence is still questioned, still challenged, still met with resistance. Not because of what she's done, but because of what she represents. A disruption of outdated narratives about power, success, and belonging. And in that cabin, 30,000 feet in the air, or not yet off the ground, that truth hung heavier than gravity. The air inside the first-class cabin had turned to glass, fragile, tight, and shatter-prone, as Celeste Morgan sat upright in seat 1A, her back impossibly straight, her hands folded in her lap like a woman at a chessboard who knew her next 10 moves but still felt every blow of the one just delivered. Across from her stood Captain Grant Whitaker, his arms folded like armor, his expression a dangerous mixture of indignation and cold certainty, the kind that grows only in men who have gone unchallenged for too long. His voice had dropped a note lower now, more pointed, calculated not for diplomacy, but for authority. I won't ask again. You need to vacate the seat immediately or I will have you removed by security. His tone wasn't raised, but it cut all the same. Quiet threats always did. Around them, heads turned, and murmurs buzzed like flies in the corners of the cabin. The humiliation wasn't just implied now, it was broadcast. Eyes lingered, not in solidarity, not yet, but in fascination, perhaps even expectation. Celeste could feel the sharp edge of their gaze crawling over her skin like static. And still she did not move. Her breath, shallow but sure, was the only sign of the storm building behind her otherwise calm eyes. It would have been so easy to stand, to shrink, to excuse herself, and dissolve into the background of a world that was already eager to erase her. But she had spent too many years doing that, biting her tongue, giving people the benefit of the doubt, smoothing the edges of her own presence to make others more comfortable. Not this time. I am not moving, she said quietly, but her voice carried, steady and strong. She lifted her ticket again, as if daring him to argue with it, as if the paper in her hand weighed more than his entire history of unchecked power. You're welcome to call security, she added, but I'll be right here when they arrive. She wasn't angry, not in the way he expected. She didn't yell, didn't match his tone. That would have given him something to use against her. No, her composure, her exacting calm, was the weapon he hadn't prepared for. Whitaker flinched, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. A falter, a flicker of something he hadn't expected to encounter. Resistance that didn't roar but refused to budge. Celeste's chest burned, not with rage, but with the exhaustion of having to constantly prove what should have been obvious. She had earned this seat, not just with money, but with years of excellence, with endless nights building a life most wouldn't even attempt. And still she had to defend it. Then came the next blow. 2 security officers appeared at the front of the cabin, their eyes scanning the space. One of them resting a hand on the walkie at his hip like a casual threat. The atmosphere shifted again, heavier this time. It wasn't just about a seat now, it was about narrative, perception, control. The 2 men stepped forward with caution, already sensing the spectacle they were being pulled into. Ma'am, the younger one said, his voice gentler than she expected, we've been asked to escort you off the aircraft. A hush fell, as though the entire cabin leaned in to listen for her next breath. For what? Celeste asked, her tone razor-sharp despite the tremor she felt rising in her throat. What is my offense? She held up the ticket, again unmoved. This is my seat. Am I being asked to leave because of my skin color? Her words were a detonation, sharp and unavoidable. They rang through the cabin like church bells on a silent morning, cutting through every whisper, every sidelong glance, every ounce of plausible deniability that Whitaker or anyone else might have clung to. The question hung there, raw and honest and devastating in its simplicity. The officers froze, suddenly uncertain, suddenly aware that this moment was bigger than procedure. The pilot stepped forward again, cheeks flushed, jaw locked tight. "Don't make this into something it's not," he hissed. Celeste stood, not to surrender but to rise. Slowly, with deliberate grace, she faced him full on. "I'm not making anything," she said, her voice low, controlled, unshakable. "You already did, when you looked at me and decided I didn't belong here. When you ignored the truth in my hand because it didn't fit the picture in your mind." Around her, the other passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. She felt the shift, subtle but certain, like a current beginning to turn. "I have followed every rule. I have done nothing wrong. If I were anyone else, anyone who looked like you would have never dared to question me." Her eyes didn't leave his. "You don't scare me. Not with your title, not with your badge, and certainly not with your assumptions." Silence. Dense, vibrating silence. And then, like thunder breaking through cloud, a new voice rang out, a voice calm but deep with a command. "Is there a problem here?" Heads turned. A man in a tailored Navy suit stepped into the aisle. His presence was magnetic. The security officers straightened instinctively. Captain Whitaker's face paled. The man extended a badge. "Jonathan Morgan, Executive Director, Sky Connect Airlines." A beat passed, then another, and the pieces began to fall. Murmurs returned, this time laced with recognition. Not just curiosity. Whitaker's expression buckled, confusion giving way to dread. But Celeste didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse into relief. She simply exhaled, as if releasing years of unspoken tension from her chest. Jonathan stepped toward her, his voice low but urgent. "You okay?" She nodded. "I am now." But the damage was done, and she knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, because this wasn't just about one man, one seat, one humiliating moment. This was about the system that allowed it to happen, and how many others had been quietly removed, silently erased, without anyone speaking up, but not today. Today she had stayed in her seat. She had stood in her truth. And for the first time in a long while, someone else had been the one forced to back down. And if you think this story ends with her simply sipping champagne and forgetting the whole thing, think again. The truth is just beginning to rise. And so is Celeste. Don't walk away yet. What happens next will shake the entire foundation of everything that flight crew thought they could get away with. Stay with me. The real justice? It's about to take flight. Just as the confrontation reached its cruel crescendo, Captain Grant Whitaker standing over Celeste Morgan, security officers lingering in the aisle, and the hum of murmurs growing heavier with every silent second, a voice cut through the rising tension like a sudden gust through stale air. "What exactly is going on here?" The voice was calm, measured, but unmistakably commanding. Heads turned like dominoes toward the front of the plane. Standing there, tall and composed in a tailored Navy suit, was a man whose presence shifted the entire gravity of the room. Jonathan Morgan, Celeste's husband, stepped fully into view, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a practiced calm that made even the officers straighten. His dark eyes locked on his wife, and for the briefest second, the storm in her eyes softened. She hadn't expected him. He wasn't supposed to fly until the next morning. But there he was, as if the universe had known she would need someone, not just to witness, but to stand beside her. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," the captain said quickly, his voice tight. "I'm handling a passenger issue." But Jonathan didn't even blink. He simply reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a sleek leather badge case. He flipped it open with silent precision, revealing a gold emblem and a nameplate that read in bold, unforgiving letters, "Jonathan Morgan, Executive Vice President, Sky Connect Airlines." Gasps rippled through the cabin like the distant crack of thunder before a downpour. The security officers stepped back instinctively. Captain Whitaker paled, the arrogance draining from his face like water from a punctured balloon. "I believe this concerns me now," Jonathan said, his voice still low but carrying more weight than Whitaker's bark ever had. "Would someone care to explain why my wife is being harassed in her assigned seat, in front of a cabin full of witnesses?" The captain stammered, the composure he had worn like armor now crumbling under the weight of real authority. "It's a misunderstanding, Mr. Morgan," he said, eyes darting nervously between the passengers and the man now holding his fate in his hands. There was some confusion with the ticket. Jonathan took the boarding pass from Celeste, holding it up for all to see. "No confusion. This ticket says 1A. This woman is my wife, and you chose to make her justify herself publicly, humiliatingly, because your bias couldn't comprehend her presence in this seat." Celeste remained seated, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. The fight was still in her, but now something else had crept in: relief. Not because she couldn't defend herself, but because someone else finally had. For once, she didn't have to carry the entire burden alone. She looked up at Jonathan, and in his jaw, she saw the same steel she had seen 10 years ago, when she was fresh out of grad school and the world told her to temper her ambition. He had always seen her clearly, long before the magazine covers, the awards, the sold-out keynote speeches. And long before this flight, he had fought beside her. But something about today felt different. He wasn't just her partner now, he was a witness to how often the world demanded that she prove her worth. Even now. And then, unbidden, a memory surged, sharp and unrelenting. Celeste was 23 again, walking into her first investor meeting with a revolutionary idea and nothing but a pitch deck and a heart full of hope. She had waited outside the glass conference room for over an hour, only to be told by a receptionist that the executives assumed she was one of the interns and had left early. She had gone to the bathroom, locked the stall, and cried silently, not just from rejection, but from the knowing. The knowing that this wouldn't be the last time she was overlooked, underestimated, or deliberately excluded. She hadn't told Jonathan that day. But when she came home, he had simply pulled her close, looked her in the eyes and said, "You don't need their table. You'll build your own." And she had, with him beside her, now in seat 1A, it wasn't just about a seat. It was about every single moment like that, the big and the small, compiled into one flashpoint. And Jonathan, just like then, was standing where too many had chosen not to. "Captain Whitaker," he said coldly, "you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Upon landing, you'll report directly to the Disciplinary Review Board. Your behavior today has not only violated our professional conduct policies, but it has undermined the trust we place in the people responsible for passenger safety and respect." Whitaker opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to plead, but Jonathan raised a hand. "Don't, not now." The silence that followed was stunning. Passengers stared, some stunned, some nodding with quiet approval, and for the first time, Celeste felt the weight begin to lift, not entirely, but enough. Whitaker stood frozen, unsure whether to leave or sit, until a quiet voice from the aisle spoke up. "Captain, I think you should go." It was the flight attendant, a young black woman named Mariah, who had seen the whole thing unfold. Her eyes were glassy, but her voice was strong. "You've done enough harm today." Whitaker turned without a word, walking the walk of a man who thought himself untouchable and had finally discovered the limits of his power. As he disappeared down the aisle, Celeste let out a slow breath. Jonathan turned to her and reached for her hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "You shouldn't have had to go through that." Celeste gripped his hand tightly. "I've gone through worse," she said quietly. But this time someone saw it. Someone said something. She glanced at the cabin where passengers were still watching, still processing what had happened. And she knew then this story wasn't over. Not because she wanted vengeance, but because she needed truth. The system needed truth. And she wasn't going to rest until the next woman who looked like her could sit down without the world rising up to push her out. That reckoning was coming. And Celeste Morgan? She would be the one to deliver it. The cabin had gone quiet in that eerie, suspended way that happens when something unforgettable has just occurred, and no one quite knows what to say. Captain Whitaker's retreat was a silence-breaking act in itself. His once unshakable authority now crumbled, his boots thudding down the aisle like the fading drumbeats of a collapsing regime. Celeste Morgan remained seated, her breath finally beginning to steady, her hands still folded neatly in her lap, though her pulse throbbed at her wrists. She had fought this fight before, oh, how many times, but never with an entire cabin of strangers watching, weighing, wondering if they would have had the courage to do the same. As the tension began to recede, replaced by an aching quiet, A single voice rose from the row behind her. Soft, aged, but unwavering. He's done this before. The words fell like a match in dry grass. Every eye turned to the woman now standing in seat 3C, a regal figure with salt and pepper curls tucked behind her ears and an expression that balanced dignity with a sharp, unmistakable fire. She adjusted the scarf at her neck with a trembling hand and looked directly at Celeste. "I've flown with this airline for over 20 years," she said, loud enough for every passenger to hear. "And I've watched that man, the captain, single out passengers who didn't fit the picture he wanted in first class. Never loud, always subtle, but always cruel." Her name, as it would be revealed later, was Patricia Moore, a retired human resources executive who had built her career around identifying patterns of systemic misconduct. And now, in the middle of a darkened plane hurtling across time zones and tension, she was doing what so few had ever dared, naming the pattern out loud. "I remember once about 2 years ago," Patricia continued. "He delayed takeoff claiming a seat discrepancy. The woman he questioned had a PhD and had just returned from speaking at an international conference. He made her cry. I didn't speak up. I should have." Her voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, not with weakness, but with the weight of a regret too long carried. Celeste's throat tightened. There was something about Patricia's gaze, how it held no pity, only truth. It wasn't just her story now. It had never been. Whitaker hadn't chosen her at random. He had been operating unchecked for years. She was simply the first one who refused to move and had someone in power watching when she didn't. "Thank you," Celeste said softly, her voice layered with gratitude and pain. Patricia gave a small nod, and then she turned to the rest of the cabin. "You saw what happened here. This was never about a seat. This was about power, about who gets believed and who doesn't. And if we stay quiet now, we are no better than him." A ripple of movement followed. A man in row 5 raised his hand. "I've flown with him too," he said. "He made me show 3 forms of ID once, and I thought maybe it was just protocol, but I saw him wave the next passenger, white, younger, right through." A younger woman across the aisle added, "He once rolled his eyes when I boarded with my mother. She wears a hijab. He kept asking her if she understood English." And suddenly, what had begun as one voice became many, rising and folding together like the swell of a choir, long silenced. Celeste sat stunned, overwhelmed by the emotional avalanche of it all. The past 20 minutes had felt like years pressed into moments. But this surge of collective truth, it was something else entirely. It was justice, not as a moment, but as a movement. People were beginning to understand this wasn't a one-time offense. This was a pattern, a rot within the system that had gone unchecked because people had been too afraid, too polite, or too exhausted to call it out. But now, with the veil lifted and Whitaker's power exposed as fragile myth, there was no going back. And Celeste, she could finally breathe in a way that felt full and real. A flight attendant named Erica, who had stood silently for much of the ordeal, now stepped forward, visibly shaken. I've seen things too," she said, glancing at Patricia, then at Celeste. "He's made comments, jokes. At first I thought maybe I misheard, but it kept happening. We're told to file reports, but nothing ever comes of them. People just stop talking." Her voice trembled and then solidified. "But I don't want to be quiet anymore." She looked directly at Celeste, eyes shimmering. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I see you and I believe you." Celeste felt the heat behind her eyes before the tears came. They weren't tears of sadness, not entirely. They were the kind of tears that came when a weight that had been sitting on your soul for years suddenly shifted, when the burden of being the only one was lifted, if only slightly. She reached out and gently touched Erica's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Jonathan, seated again beside her, leaned in close, his voice low. "This isn't just a response anymore," he murmured. "It's evidence, witnesses, patterns. We can build something from this." Celeste nodded, the truth of his words striking deep. This wasn't just about her seat or his arrogance or this one flight. This was about a system that had allowed it to fester. And finally, under the flickering cabin lights, in the quiet bravery of strangers finding their voices, that system had begun to crack. By the time the flight crew confirmed Whitaker's removal from duty, and re-establish calm, the story had already begun to write itself, not just on paper, but in people's hearts. Patricia Moore returned to her seat, but not before placing a folded note on Celeste's tray table. "I'll testify," she said. "I'll back you every step of the way." Celeste unfolded it later. It was a detailed account. Names, dates, incidents. It was a map of misconduct, and the first brick in what would become a wall of accountability. She looked around the cabin, her eyes passing over faces that no longer looked away. Something had shifted, and for the first time since the pilot had dared to question her place, Celeste didn't just feel defended, she felt seen. And that, she knew, was how real change always begins. The cabin remained heavy with the echoes of voices, testimonies, confessions, regrets spoken aloud for the first time. And yet, in the center of it all sat Celeste Morgan, quiet now, but far from silent. Her stillness was not surrender. It was the center of gravity around which the cabin had shifted. Everything had changed in the span of minutes, and the man who once stood tall and untouchable at the front of the aircraft now sat isolated near the crew area, stripped of his authority, visibly unraveling beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer escape. Captain Grant Whitaker, once the undisputed voice of command, had lost control not because he made a single misstep, but because he had made many, and someone had finally said enough. That someone was Jonathan Morgan, Celeste's husband and the airline's executive vice president, a man who had walked onto that plane not just as a witness, but as a reckoning. The announcement came quietly, but firmly. Jonathan stood near the cockpit doorway, flanked by two senior flight staff and the cabin supervisor, his voice low but carrying enough steel to silence the whispers still scattering through the rows. "Effective immediately," he said, "Captain Whitaker is relieved of duty. He will not return to this aircraft in any capacity for the remainder of the flight. Upon landing, he will be met by SkyConnect's internal affairs team and formally suspended pending full investigation. This is not negotiable." There was no dramatic pause, no raised voice. Jonathan didn't need theatrics. Truth carried its own weight. "The safety and dignity of our passengers," he continued, "matter more than any title stitched on a jacket. Let today be the last time someone is made to feel unwelcome in a space they have rightfully earned." The cabin fell into stunned silence. And then slowly there came a soft clapping sound, tentative, unsure. It was Patricia Moore, hands coming together with a steady rhythm that refused to be ignored. Then came another, and another. Within seconds, the silence was broken by a ripple of applause that swept through the cabin, not in celebration, but in solidarity. Celeste, still seated, blinked back tears she hadn't planned to shed. This wasn't triumph. It was something deeper, more sacred. Recognition, restoration. For once, she wasn't asked to be the bigger person. For once, someone else had lifted the burden she had grown too used to carrying alone. Whitaker didn't speak as he was escorted to the back. His silence was his final weapon, one last attempt at control. But even that failed, because his silence no longer shaped the narrative. The story had moved on without him. And in his place stood a woman who had refused to be moved, and a man who had refused to let injustice go unchecked. Not as a husband protecting his wife, but as a leader protecting something greater: integrity. Jonathan returned to Celeste's side, his expression composed, but his jaw clenched with emotion. He reached for her hand, not to comfort, but to connect. Celeste laced her fingers through his and leaned her head against the seat for a moment, her eyes closing just long enough to take in the moment. "I wasn't sure what would happen," she whispered. "I was ready to walk off that plane if I had to." Jonathan looked at her, his eyes softening. "You never should have had to make that decision," he said. "But you didn't walk. You stayed. And because of that, he's gone. You turned this into something more than justice. You turned it into truth." A flight attendant approached. Erica, the one who had earlier apologized, was shaking hands. She knelt slightly at Celeste's row, her face more certain now. "Mrs. Morgan," she said, "we've been notified that a replacement captain is en route. The delay will be brief. I just want you to know, the crew is with you. We see what happened. We believe in what's right." Her voice caught briefly, but she pressed forward. "I've worked on this airline for 5 years. I've seen things. And I've been afraid to speak up. You gave me courage." Celeste smiled gently, the warmth behind her eyes melting some of the lingering ache. "Thank you," she said. "Just keep holding that courage. Don't let go of it." The moment was intimate, but the cabin had become a living witness. No one had looked away, and that, more than anything, made the difference. Whitaker hadn't just lost his position, he had lost his cover. The power of public accountability wasn't in humiliation. It was in the exposure, in making visible what had always been allowed to hide in plain sight, in revealing the rot beneath the shine of epaulets and protocol. Now that truth had come to light, it couldn't be dismissed, and it wouldn't be buried. Celeste looked around the cabin, at the young woman across the aisle who had mouthed, "You're amazing," at the elderly man in 5B who had offered a quiet nod of respect, at Patricia Moore, who sat now with a notepad on her tray, writing down every detail she could remember, not out of bitterness, but from a lifetime of knowing that details matter when people try to rewrite the story. Celeste's chest swelled with something she hadn't felt in years when traveling. Safety, not because of security or status, but because of shared resolve. She hadn't just been defended, she had been seen, she had been heard, and she had become, unwillingly but unflinchingly, a spark. The captain was gone, but something more powerful had stayed in his absence. A new energy, a new expectation. The passengers, the crew, even Celeste herself, none of them would unsee what had happened. The standard had been reset. As the cabin lights dimmed and passengers settled in again, there was no triumphant announcement, no champagne toast. But in the quiet hum of the engine, something had shifted. A line had been drawn, not by anger, not by revenge, but by conviction. And in that silence, Celeste whispered to Jonathan, "It's not over, is it?" He shook his head. "No, but now we're in the pilot's seat. And to anyone listening, whether in the skies or on the ground, this story isn't just about a seat. It's about the moment someone says enough. It's about accountability that doesn't wait for permission. It's about knowing that justice, when it arrives swiftly, carries not just consequence, but hope. So keep listening, because what happens next might just change the way we fly forever." The next morning, the soft light of dawn crept across the horizon as Celeste Morgan stood in the glass-walled conference room of SkyConnect's regional headquarters, her reflection cast against the pale blue sky like a quiet silhouette of strength. She hadn't slept. Neither had Jonathan. The events of the night before, the confrontation with Captain Whitaker, the flood of stories from fellow passengers, the steady unraveling of everything that had long gone unchecked, played over and over in her mind, not as trauma, but as fuel. The fatigue in her bones wasn't exhaustion. It was determination hardening into resolve. Because last night hadn't ended with applause or relief. It ended with truth, and truth demanded something more than justice for her alone. It demanded change for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a space they had every right to occupy. So when the board members trickled in, faces taut with discomfort, concern, and the polite dread reserved for PR nightmares that couldn't be spun, Celeste didn't flinch. She didn't need a podium. She stood with Jonathan beside her, unshaken, anchored by something far deeper than fury. She was here for a reckoning, yes, but also a rebuilding. A senior executive, Ishayaonu, pale, anxious, well-intentioned in all the superficial ways, began with the expected pleasantries. Apologies, shock, regret. "This is not who we are," he said, his voice brittle with corporate rehearsal. Captain Whitaker's behavior was an anomaly. Unacceptable, of course, but rare. Celeste's eyes narrowed. "It wasn't rare," she said, her voice calm but unsparing. "You just weren't watching. But now that you've seen it, you don't get to look away." There was a pause, a silence thick with discomfort. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low, deliberate. "Let me be clear," he said. "What happened on that flight wasn't a PR issue. It wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a symptom, a reflection of an institutional culture that allows bias to go unchecked because it hides behind professionalism, behind rank, behind silence." Celeste turned to the faces at the table, faces that for years had only seen her through articles, quarterly reports, or Jonathan's quiet admiration. Now they were seeing her clearly, not just as a passenger who had been wronged, but as a mirror, showing them the quiet complicity they had allowed to grow beneath their very feet. Do you know how many times I've been questioned when boarding a flight in first class? She asked, not needing an answer. Do you know how many women like me get second-glanced, second-guessed, or dismissed entirely? And it's not just in the sky. It's in hotel lobbies, boardrooms, classrooms. But this time, the man who challenged my right to be seen didn't realize I wasn't alone. Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with weight. This time, someone with power stood up. But what about the times no one did? She reached into her bag and placed a folded document on the table. This is a written statement from Patricia Moore, passenger in 3C, a retired HR executive. She witnessed similar behavior from Captain Whitaker on multiple occasions. She stayed silent until last night. She set down a second envelope. These are internal complaints from two flight attendants, both describing inappropriate conduct from the same captain over a 2-year period. Buried, never addressed. She let the room absorb it. So don't tell me this was an anomaly. This was a pattern, one that you failed to see because you didn't want to look too closely. One executive reached for the papers, his hands slightly trembling. The atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer damage control. This was a call to account. And Celeste wasn't done. I'm not here to shame you. I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for action. So let me tell you what needs to happen next. Her tone hardened, not cruel but certain. You need a complete overhaul of your bias and equity training. Not just modules employees can click through in 30 minutes and forget by lunch, but immersive face-to-face programs that dismantle the assumptions people don't even realize they carry. She stepped forward, her presence expanding, commanding. You need a system of accountability that doesn't rely on hierarchy to determine truth. A complaint system with anonymous protections, third-party oversight, and full transparency. Because right now, your people don't feel safe speaking up. And when people are afraid to speak, injustice thrives. A soft rustle echoed in the room as Jonathan opened a file. We've also drafted a model for an internal equity review panel comprised of employees at every level. Pilots, crew, ground staff, not just executives. He passed copies around the table. It will review complaints, policy gaps, and ensure enforcement actually happens. This isn't about bad press. This is about rebuilding trust. Celeste's voice lowered, but every word hit with precision. The truth is, most people who experience what I did don't have someone like Jonathan walking in with a badge to stop it. They don't have boardroom access or media attention or witnesses brave enough to speak. They carry it silently, daily, and still, they show up. So I'm asking you to do what they've been doing all along. Show up for them. She paused then, her throat tightening with a wave she didn't expect. Because I've been that woman on the verge of tears in an airplane restroom, wiping her face before rejoining a world that refuses to see her. I've been the girl turned away from first-class lounges with a platinum card in her hand. I've been the student who was told to smile more and ask less, and I'm still standing. But we can't keep expecting people to fight these battles alone. A long, aching silence followed, the kind that usually ends in deflection. But not this time. We hear you, one board member said quietly, and this time, it felt honest. And we're ready to make changes. Celeste nodded once, tired but firm. Then let's begin. And for the first time in a long time, she walked out of a meeting, not with relief, but with hope. Hope that change didn't just happen in loud public moments, but in quiet rooms where truth finally had a seat at the table. It began with a single voice. Patricia Moore, seated quietly in her living room days after the flight, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed a pen to paper. What she wrote wasn't flowery or poetic. It was clinical, precise, and heartbreakingly honest. A detailed timeline of every instance she could remember when Captain Whitaker had humiliated, questioned, or subtly undermined passengers who looked like Celeste Morgan. Black women, immigrants, people with accents, people who didn't dress the way he thought they should. She recounted the time he made a Nigerian professor verify her doctorate in front of the entire cabin. The way he had once rolled his eyes at a Latina mother trying to calm her child. How he had smirked when a Sikh man asked for help storing his carry-on, only to be told, "You people always bring too much." Each memory was a wound she hadn't realized she'd been carrying, reopened by what she'd witnessed on that flight. Her note ended simply, "I didn't know how much I had let slide. Thank you, Celeste, for showing me how not to." That letter, modest, folded, and delivered to Sky Connect's legal team, became the spark that lit the path forward. Because Patricia wasn't the only one. The next letter came from Daniel Reyes, a soft-spoken engineer who had been seated 3 rows behind Celeste. He wrote about how watching her that night reminded him of his own mother, who had once been escorted off a flight when she tried to use the business-class restroom. "I didn't speak up then," he confessed in his email, "but I should have. I won't make that mistake again." Then came a message from Tanya Patel, a young medical student from Houston. "I've been asked 5 times this year alone to prove my seat was mine," she wrote, "and every time I shrank. Celeste didn't. Watching her, I realized that my silence wasn't keeping me safe. It was keeping the system intact." Within a week, over 30 passengers from past Sky Connect flights had submitted reports, not just about Whitaker, but about others like him. Gate agents, crew members, pilots who made people feel like intruders in their own success. The stories flooded in like a tide that had been waiting to rise. And Celeste, reading each one in the quiet corners of her home office, felt something she hadn't expected. Grief and gratitude in equal measure. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't boarded that plane expecting to be a symbol, but somehow, through her quiet refusal to be erased, she had become a mirror, a vessel, a voice. And the others? They had found the courage to speak because she had spoken first. There was one message, handwritten on lined notebook paper, that Celeste kept on her desk. It came from a young girl named Lena, 15 years old, who had been on the flight with her father. "I watched you," the note said in neat cursive, "and I want to be like you. People tried to make you small, but you stayed big. I used to think I had to be quiet to be safe, but now I think I want to be brave." Celeste had read those words 3 times before letting the tears fall freely. Because what she had done that day, what had seemed so small, so ordinary, so forced by necessity, was now changing the way others saw themselves. The way young girls like Lena believed they could move through the world. And then came the moment she knew they had crossed a threshold. Sky Connect's internal investigation had launched just 48 hours after the flight. But what they didn't expect, what no one could have predicted, was the volume of support pouring in not just from passengers, but from employees. Flight attendants, baggage handlers, even junior pilots began sharing anonymous statements. A young black crew member using the alias B-17 submitted a 2-page letter outlining the ways she had been routinely spoken over in safety meetings, ignored in scheduling, and left out of key decision-making processes. "We've all seen what Whitaker did," she wrote. "He's not an outlier. He's the blueprint. And it's time we tear the blueprint apart." The company's legal inbox flooded. Celeste was forwarded copies by Jonathan, now spearheading the accountability response from the inside. He sent them late at night with simple subject lines like, "You started this," or "Look at the wave behind you." She'd lie awake afterward, reading testimonies from people who had worked for years in silence. A senior mechanic wrote about how his accent made his colleagues question his intelligence. A pilot in training shared how, after graduating top of her class, she was told by an instructor, "You don't look like command material." All of it was painful, all of it was true. And now none of it was being swallowed quietly. Celeste's story had made its way to the media by then, not because she sought it, but because others refused to let it go unnoticed. But what the headlines couldn't capture, what no reporter could neatly wrap into a quote, was the chorus of courage that had emerged in her wake. What had begun as one woman saying, "I'm not moving," had become hundreds saying, "Neither are we." And somehow, through it all, she remained centered. She went to work. She planned her speeches. She kissed Jonathan goodbye in the mornings and thanked him when he came home with tired eyes and updates from the leadership meetings. But inside her, something had awakened. Not rage, not pride, but a deep and resounding purpose. In the quiet moments, before sleep, before interviews, before meetings with Sky Connect's Diversity Council, she would reread Lena's letter, and she would remember the faces on the plane, not the ones who looked away, but the ones who found their voice because she had used hers, the ones who dared to rise because someone else stood first. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about visibility. And that, Celeste knew, was the real power. When one person stands, Others find the strength to rise too. The ripple didn't come as a wave all at once. It came softly at first, like the quiet hush before dawn, then with a steady, undeniable momentum that no one could ignore. In the weeks following the flight, as the investigation into Captain Grant Whitaker deepened and stories poured in from passengers, staff, and former employees alike, Celeste Morgan watched a truth she had lived with in silence become public, and finally, undeniable. SkyConnect Airlines, once known for glossy advertisements and luxury branding, suddenly found itself at the heart of a national reckoning. The company's board issued an official apology, not just to Celeste, but to every passenger who had been mistreated, profiled, silenced, or dismissed. But Celeste didn't need their words. She needed their actions. And this time, they delivered. On a rainy Monday morning, 3 weeks after the flight, Captain Whitaker was officially terminated. The press release was sterile. Failure to uphold company values, conduct unbecoming. But behind the carefully chosen words was the truth. He had been held accountable. The announcement came in the middle of a strategy meeting Celeste had been invited to lead, and when Jonathan leaned over to whisper, "It's done," something in her finally released. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just exhaled. Because justice wasn't a climax, it was a beginning. But what mattered more, what reached deeper than any individual consequence, was the sweeping change that followed. Celeste and Jonathan had recommended an equity reform task force, and within weeks, the airline created a permanent division focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, reporting directly to the CEO. Not just a symbolic gesture, but one with real authority. Celeste was asked to co-chair the advisory board, and though part of her wanted to step back and recover, another part, the part still burning with the memory of Whitaker's words, the part that carried Lena's letter in her purse, knew she couldn't walk away. She agreed, not because it was easy, but because too many others never got the chance. And change, real change, began to take form. The first training Celeste helped develop wasn't about compliance. It was about consciousness. Interactive sessions with real scenarios, led by facilitators who understood systemic bias not as theory, but as lived experience. Pilots sat next to ground staff, executives sat across from flight attendants. And for the first time, people in the company began to have the conversations they had long avoided. There were uncomfortable moments. There were tears, and there were breakthroughs. One senior pilot, tears streaking down his weathered cheeks, confessed during a session, "I didn't know I had become someone others feared speaking to." Celeste sat in the back, her presence quiet but grounding. It wasn't just about telling her story anymore. It was about making room for others to tell theirs. She also spearheaded a new anonymous reporting system, one that didn't route complaints through biased chains of command, but gave employees a safe and direct line to real oversight. Within a month of launch, over 200 submissions came through. Many detailed past experiences that had never been acknowledged. Others offered ideas for change, and one, from a junior flight attendant, simply read, "Because of you, I believe someone will listen this time." Still, even as progress bloomed inside boardrooms and hangars, the world outside had taken notice. Media outlets picked up the story, and soon Celeste's face appeared on morning shows and headlines across the country. She was hesitant, even uncomfortable with the attention, not because she feared it, but because she knew what the world often did with stories like hers. It turned them into symbols and then forgot the people inside them. But this wasn't about a viral moment. It was about the real people watching from the margins. Young professionals of color, working mothers, quiet warriors who had long learned to make themselves small to survive. One such person was Maya Carter, a single mother and airport employee who had worked 12-hour shifts without ever feeling truly seen. She approached Celeste during an employee luncheon, nervously holding her hands together. "I was there that night," she whispered. "I was cleaning the terminal floor when I saw them escort you back onto the plane. I didn't know who you were then, but I watched. I prayed you'd stay strong, because I knew that if you could, maybe one day I could too." Celeste pulled Maya into a hug, the two women holding each other not as strangers, but as reflections. Celeste began receiving hundreds of letters from teachers, students, passengers, flight crews, but it wasn't until she opened a small envelope with no return address that she truly broke down. Inside was a child's crayon drawing. A woman with curly hair standing tall in front of a plane, holding a small, brown-skinned girl's hand. Above it, the words, "You made me feel big." There was no name, just a drawing, just the weight of being seen. And still, Celeste kept going. She and Jonathan drafted new hiring protocols, ensuring underrepresented voices were recruited not as tokens, but as leaders. They launched mentorship programs, invited outside speakers, and partnered with historically Black colleges and universities for aviation internships. Celeste knew reform wasn't instant, but every policy, every conversation was a seed, and she was planting as many as she could. Then came the moment she didn't see coming. SkyConnect's CEO offered to rename their upcoming leadership initiative in her honor, the Morgan Equity Fellowship. Celeste declined. "This isn't about my name," she said. "It's about the space we make for others." Instead, she proposed the name Flight 1A, a nod to the seat where she refused to move, and to the countless people who had been moved, dismissed, or erased before her. The board agreed. And in a tearful ceremony, Flight 1A was launched, a leadership pipeline for women and people of color in aviation, designed to lift voices, not silence them. Standing at the podium that day, Celeste looked out over the crowd, new recruits, industry veterans, student pilots. She took a breath and spoke. "I didn't plan to lead a movement. I just wanted to sit in my seat in peace." But peace, she paused, her voice catching, is not the absence of conflict. Peace is what happens when enough people refuse to look away. The crowd stood, applauded, and Celeste? She smiled, not because it was over, but because it was just beginning. The lights dimmed in the grand ballroom of the Global Future Summit, the hum of conversation dissolving into reverent silence as the final introduction rang out. "Please welcome to the stage, strategist, author, and advocate for equity, Celeste Morgan." For a moment, the room stood still, the weight of expectation hanging in the air like a held breath. Then she stepped into the spotlight. No fanfare, no exaggerated smile, just quiet grace and an unwavering presence. Her heels clicked softly against the polished stage as she walked to the podium, each step steady, grounded, and purposeful. It had been months since that flight, months since the moment that changed not only her life, but the course of an entire organization. But standing here now, beneath the sweeping glow of chandeliers and the fixed gaze of thousands, Celeste wasn't just a speaker. She was a mirror, a memory, and a movement, all at once. She took in the audience, world leaders, CEOs, students, activists, media figures, and ordinary people who had flown across oceans to be here. She saw their eyes wide, alert, some brimming with quiet awe, others with expectation. And in the back row, Jonathan Morgan, her husband, her anchor, sat with his hands clasped and his gaze locked on hers, pride painted into the lines of his face. Next to him sat Lena, the teenage girl who had once slipped her a letter with crayon hearts, now invited as an honored guest. Celeste breathed in, and then she spoke, not with drama, not with thunder, but with the kind of calm that commands a room without asking permission. "I almost didn't make it here," she began. "Not because of weather or scheduling or logistics, but because someone once looked at me and decided I didn't belong in seat 1A. There was a pause, audible gasps, subtle murmurs. Most had heard the story in pieces, filtered through headlines and social media clips. But this was different. This was her voice, her truth, unfiltered. What happened on that flight wasn't just about one pilot and one seat," she continued, her voice steady and resonant. "It was about a lifetime of being told, directly or indirectly, that success looks a certain way, that belonging must be earned twice over, that no matter how high you climb, someone will still ask to see your ticket." Her gaze swept the room. "I was humiliated, publicly, wrongfully, but I didn't move. Not because I wasn't afraid, I was, but because I was tired of making myself small to survive." The room was so quiet, the hum of the air vents seemed thunderous. Celeste paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her truth land exactly where it needed to. "Since that day," she said, "people have called me brave, a hero, a symbol. But the truth is, I didn't feel like any of those things. I felt exposed. I felt angry. I felt exhausted. And I felt deeply aware of how many women, how many Black women, had been through the same thing, or worse, and walked off the plane without anyone ever knowing their names. Her voice caught slightly, and she paused. The only difference that day was that someone was there to see. Someone with power said, "Not this time." But what about the times no one's watching? She lifted her chin, her posture radiating strength. That's why I'm standing here. Not because of what happened, but because of what followed. Because of the flood of voices that rose after mine. Because of the passengers who wrote letters. Because of the crew members who came forward. Because of the young girl who told me I made her feel big. Her eyes flicked to Lena, who beamed back with tears in her eyes. That's what this is about. Not recognition, not vengeance, but visibility, dignity, and the right to exist in every room, every board meeting, every cockpit, and every seat without being questioned. She shifted slightly, and her tone softened. There was a time early in my career when I stood outside a boardroom for 45 minutes, waiting to be let in, only to realize they had already started without me. They assumed I was the assistant. I cried in the restroom that day. I remember looking at myself in the mirror and wondering if I should lower my voice, straighten my hair, smile more, say less. But I didn't, and I'm so glad I didn't. Because now I look in the mirror and see someone who speaks not just for herself, but for everyone who ever sat alone on the edge of belonging. The room was now completely still, breath held, eyes wet, hearts cracked wide open. And yet, Celeste continued, not from a place of pain, but from power. What happened on that flight showed me something I'll never forget, she said. That silence doesn't protect us. It preserves injustice. And that the minute we speak up, even if our voices tremble, we give someone else permission to do the same. That's how change begins, not with legislation or statements or even policies, but with one person saying, "This isn't right," and another saying, "You're not alone." There were people in that room who had faced their own moments of being questioned, overlooked, underestimated. CEOs who were the only woman in the boardroom, students who had changed their names on resumes, leaders who still carried scars from years of silence. Celeste was speaking not just to them, but for them. She took a breath, the final words building behind her chest like a rising tide. So if you remember nothing else from today, remember this. Power used in silence is complicity. But power used in truth? Her voice surged. That is liberation. And every one of us has it. The power to speak, to act, to rise. Whether you're in 1A or in the last row near the bathroom, you deserve to be seen, to be respected, to belong. The room erupted, not just into applause, but into something deeper. People stood, hands clapped over hearts. Some wept openly. Jonathan stood first, his face bright with tears and pride. Lena stood too, her hands shaking. Reporters put down their pens. Executives glanced at each other, silently vowing to do better. Celeste stepped back from the podium, her breath finally exhaled. She wasn't just a keynote speaker. She was the embodiment of what it meant to rise from injustice, to lead with grace, and to turn personal pain into collective purpose. And as she walked off that stage, the applause still rising behind her, she knew with full clarity this wasn't her finish line. This was her takeoff. It was a clear, golden morning when Celeste Morgan and her husband Jonathan arrived at the airport once more. This time, not with anxiety clenching in her chest, but with a quiet, radiant peace. The terminal bustled with its usual rhythm, announcements, children tugging at backpacks, business travelers tapping away on laptops. But today it felt different. Celeste's hand rested lightly in Jonathan's as they walked toward the Sky Connect priority check-in, not out of fear or tension, but out of something deeper: gratitude. They had been through a storm. They had faced injustice, confronted power, and refused to be silenced. And now, as they prepared to board a new flight, this time for a long-awaited vacation, Celeste walked tall, her presence unshakable, her name now a symbol not of victimhood, but of victory. As they approached the counter, the young woman at the desk looked up and smiled. Not the forced, unsure smile Celeste had grown used to receiving in these spaces, but one of genuine warmth. "Mrs. Morgan," she said gently, "we're honored to have you with us today. Thank you for everything you've done. Your seat is ready. 1A, of course." Celeste blinked for a moment, surprised. Not because of the acknowledgement, but because of the sincerity in it. Thank you, she replied, her voice soft with emotion. That means more than you know. Jonathan grinned beside her, his arm wrapped casually around her waist. Looks like the skies are a little different now, he whispered. Celeste smiled, because we made them that way. They moved through security with ease, and as they entered the gate area, something beautiful happened. A group of flight attendants standing nearby offered a small, respectful nod. A young man in a Sky Connect uniform stopped them. You're Mrs. Morgan, right? He asked, a little breathless. I started flight training because of your story. I just wanted to say thank you for making room for people like me. Celeste placed a hand on his shoulder, warmth blooming in her chest. You belong here, she said, and never let anyone make you question that. Boarding began soon after, and when they stepped onto the plane, the captain himself emerged from the cockpit. This time, a young black woman named Captain Simone Hale. Mrs. Morgan, she said, extending her hand, I wouldn't be in this seat if it weren't for women like you. Welcome aboard. We're honored to fly you today. Celeste shook her hand, her voice catching slightly. I'm honored to be here. As they made their way down the aisle, passengers turned their heads, this time not in suspicion, but in admiration. Some applauded softly, others simply smiled. Seat 1A waited at the front, pristine and prepared, a quiet tribute to all that had happened and all that had changed. As she sat, Celeste rested her head back against the leather headrest, her hand reaching for Jonathan's across the aisle. He leaned toward her. How does it feel? He asked. Celeste looked out the window, the morning sun bathing the wing in gold. Like freedom, she said. Like hope. The plane ascended minutes later, the world below growing smaller, the sky stretching wide and open before them. Celeste closed her eyes for a moment, letting it all settle. The memory of that terrible day, the pain of being questioned, the fire of refusing to be moved, the voices that rose beside hers, the girl with the crayon letter, the reforms, the truth. And now, this. Not an ending, but a beginning. As they soared above the clouds, she pulled out her journal and wrote just a few words. We don't rise by fighting for ourselves alone. We rise by making space for others to rise too. That was the truth of it. That was the story. Celeste hadn't set out to change a company. She hadn't planned to become a symbol. She just wanted to sit in the seat she'd earned. But when she stood up, when she refused to shrink, she gave others permission to rise with her. And for anyone listening now, for those who've been overlooked, underestimated, or told you don't belong, let Celeste's story be your reminder. You are not alone. You do not need to change who you are to fit. You already belong, and your presence, your voice, your truth matters. Whether in a classroom, a courtroom, an office, or a plane, you have the right to sit fully in the space you've worked for. Don't move to make others comfortable. Stand your ground. Speak your truth. Because when one voice speaks with dignity, others find the courage to do the same. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you of your own worth or of someone you love, please like this video. It helps more people hear Celeste's story. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts or send her your support. She reads every message. And if you want to be part of a growing community that celebrates strength, justice, and stories that matter, subscribe to this channel right now. We share stories like this, true, raw, powerful stories, because we believe they have the power to heal, to change, and to inspire. Celeste Morgan's journey didn't end with justice. It blossomed into hope. And now that hope is hers to carry. But it's also ours. Together we rise. Together we build something better. And together we fly toward a future where no one has to fight alone just to take their seat. So stay with us. There are more stories coming. Stories of courage, of resilience, of quiet strength that changes everything. Thank you for watching. And remember, the sky is no longer the limit. It's the promise.